In mid-February, cold Arctic air, usually contained up north in the Earth's jet stream, dipped down into the U.S. It's called a polar vortex, and it's pretty common. It's what brings the coldest air to the U.S. during the winter. What was unusual is for it to dip as far south as it did. In Texas, where February is typically fairly warm, temperatures dipped dangerously low. And it came with a storm. More than 4 million Texans lost power. Many wouldn't get it back for nearly 5 days. By then, pipes had frozen, people were melting snow for drinking water, and dozens had died from the cold in their cars and in their homes. And it was almost even worse. The state's entire electrical grid was within seconds and minutes of a failure that would have lasted months. But even though this storm hit this huge area, it was really just Texas that had major loss of power. There's a reason for that, and it should be a warning sign for the rest of the US. When you flip your lights on, you're getting your electricity from the power grid, and that grid is getting the electricity from a bunch of different energy systems, like nuclear power plants or wind farms or natural gas facilities. In the US, these places are generally run by private energy companies that work with your local power utility, which directs the electricity around the grid and into your home. That power utility is overseen by a government commission who sets things like prices and safety standards. And the grids most Americans are on aren't just big, they're huge. The entire East Coast, from Canada to Florida, is on one grid, and the entire West Coast is connected in another.
It's kind of a remarkable engineering feat. It's probably the biggest machine humans have ever built.
While most power tends to stay local, this grid allows electricity to flow over huge areas and between states. Like in New York City, power comes from energy plants in New York, but also from neighboring states and even Canada. This huge grid also means in emergencies, power can be directed where it's needed. Like in Oklahoma, which was also hit bad during the February winter storm. They needed more power, and instead of completely losing it, they were able to get electricity from neighboring states through the grid. But it's not so seamless to send it to Texas. Texas opted out of the big grids, back when they were being built nearly 100 years ago. Since they covered several states, it meant the federal government could regulate them. Texas was not into that.
Texas decided to kind of go it alone. It's a very uniquely Texas-type thing to do, right?
So most of Texas is on its own grid. It means they don't have to follow the same regulations as the rest of the country, like reliability and cost standards. But it also means when it lost power in the storm, it couldn't easily get electricity from other states. Its independence kept it in the dark. But it wasn't the reason it went dark in the first place. Being on its own, Texas has to make all their own power. They have a variety of sources. When the storm came, it affected every one. Several coal plants stopped operating as coal piles froze. One of 4 Texan nuclear plants went offline. Some wind turbines stopped working in the freezing cold.
But the biggest failure in terms of its magnitude and its impact was the natural gas system.
Natural gas, which actually contains water vapor, froze in storage wells and pipelines. Every one of these systems failed, in part, and it had nothing to do with the type of energy and everything to do with these companies not being prepared for the cold.
Clearly, you can run an energy system in cold temperatures. There are wind turbines operating in Antarctica and gas plants in Alaska and Alberta. So this is not a technology-specific issue. It was more a failure to anticipate that this is something that could even occur in Texas at this, length and severity, and to prepare for extreme cold temperatures.
But it should have been anticipated, because this has happened in Texas before. In 1989, the same kind of Arctic storm caused natural gas plants to have the same problems, resulting in rolling blackouts. And the same thing again in 2011. And both times, federal commissions recommended utilities ensure reliability in extreme weather conditions, and specifically for the state government to create winterization standards for these energy sources. The Texas Utility Commission did make those standards, but also made them voluntary, so most companies didn't winterize. Private companies like these don't have an incentive to spend their money preparing for unpredictable and infrequent events without being required to. But this problem is not limited to Texas.
The particular vulnerability to the extreme cold may be a uniquely or extremely Texas thing. I think what it shows you is you need to check your blind spots, right? And that applies everywhere.
This is a chart of the last 40 years of severe weather disasters in the U.S. Storms in particular are in orange. Here is the Texas winter storm in 1989 and the one in 2011. These costly disasters are becoming more frequent, not just in Texas, but nationally and globally. And the U.S. is not prepared. Most of this grid was built 60 to 70 years ago, but was only built to last 50 years. And some studies point to nearly 100 facilities, like power plants, in immediate danger of flooding and storm surges. Most of these private energy companies across the U.S. aren't going to change unless they're required to. But these utility commissions can require it, as can state governments and the federal government. All three can even help pay for it. Texas was warned for 30 years to prepare its energy systems for severe weather and climate change, but they didn't. Now, the rest of the U.S. is facing the same problem.
It is a wake-up call for everywhere to think about how do we prepare our energy infrastructures and our other critical infrastructure for extreme events that may become more severe and may become more likely. And that isn't about just thinking about what's probable, but also what can break the system in a way that's catastrophic.
Hi, everybody. Starting Encontros por acaso número 39. As you know, this is a periodic live in which I invite my friends who live outside Brazil to share their experience and their knowledge. Today, I'm very proud to have my friend Shamim Ahmed, CTO for DevOps Solutions at Broadcom, joining us. And he'll be talking to us about the similarities of major electrical outages and software incidents. Shamim, before we start, you might tell us a bit about your current role at Broadcom, and thank you very much for being with us.
Hi, Bazaar, and thanks for having me, and good morning and good afternoon to everybody who's joined, and thanks for joining. Bazaar and I have been friends for a while. I'm the CTO of DevOps Solutions in Broadcom. I think you and I met probably 3 or 4 years ago, Bazaar, right?
Right.
Having a discussion around SRE while you were at ITAO, right? So my background is about application development, application delivery, and what I do in my current job is focus on strategic innovations around DevOps using our technologies that we have at Broadcom. I'm also very passionate about emerging disciplines in DevOps, such as SRE and use of AI and machine learning in DevOps. So, this disaster that Bazaar was talking about is very personal for me. Like I live in Dallas, and I was personally affected. I lost power for more than 4 days, so I thought, hey, I need to do something about this. I need to write a blog that compares the two situations and how remarkable the similarities are between software reliability and grid reliability.
And
so,
I know
Bazaar, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this.
Thank you. Shamim has very, very interesting articles about SRE testing. I know the first one I read was about the correlation between SRE and testing. That was very interesting, but it's a talk for another time. Yep. So before we start that, so today I have a special guest with us, Thiago Oliveira, who is a chapter lead at DevOps Institute in Brazil, and to help me with the questions. Hi, Thiago. Thank you very much for joining us as well.
Hi. It's a pleasure. Otherwise, we could not have another option, of course, because Bezerra invited us, and when Bezerra invited us, we should go there, okay? But let's talk. It should be funny, Shamim. It should be funny.
It's
Shamim.
My pleasure. I see we have some friends just joining us, Carlos Chagas, Cristiano from Portugal or Recife. I never know where this guy is. Let's see. And we have Luis Simeone from Hong Kong.
Wow.
Let's see. It's just not working. Yeah, let's see. Here, just interesting. So I'm gonna just go through our references. The video we showed in the beginning of this live, explain a little bit about what happened in Texas. And as you know, we had something similar here in Brazil, the power outage in Amapá, but it's not exactly due to the storm, but due to a fire in a substation that could be maybe prevented. What lessons we learned from power outages and how we can apply them to the discipline of site reliability engineering?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bazaar, right? And so both the incident that happened in Texas and the one that happened in Brazil, as you noted, are because of unforeseen circumstances that the authorities didn't plan for, right? And that's all about how we go about ensuring reliability of our software as well. I mean, the whole idea of software reliability is not just to make sure that the software performs at the normal expected loads and capacities and everything, but also preparing for incidents like this, right? Like outages and making sure that we're ready to handle those outages. I would say there are 5 or 6 key points that strike out to me as things that we should talk about. First and foremost is advanced planning, right? So as that video clearly mentioned, the authorities in Texas had a long time to plan for this incident, right? It's not like they were taken by surprise. That has happened before, and they were warned by other people that they would like to happen, but they didn't really do anything about it. On the other hand, we see in real world companies that are truly care about reliability spend a lot of time and energy in planning, right? They do capacity analysis, they do architecture analysis, they do a lot of planning, for example, around SLOs and SLIs. Those are very standard SRE metrics. So, and based on the plan, they create systems that can stand up to these kinds of outages, potential outages, and disruptions, right? That's the key point, that planning is very, very key. Nobody plans to fail, right? We actually fail to plan.
Just I know you like to say in your blog, you say you don't plan to fail, you fail to plan, right?
Yeah.
So explain how SRE plans and track using SLOs, SLIs, SLAs. I mean, could help us with that. The same way maybe Texas had the warnings, but I mean nobody listened. Maybe Amapá had the warnings, but nobody listened.
Yeah.
How could this correlation with software? Because sometimes software, they tell us they're gonna break, right?
Absolutely. So I think the key thing is, for us to be able to determine, what the current SLI is, the service level indicators are, and what the, for example, certain peak conditions that may be reached, and plan for that, right? So what is the plan for example, if a certain number of power plants go down, for example, or in our case, what is the plan if a certain number of servers go down or a certain application goes down, right? So if you have the right service level objective that says, despite these failures, I still have to deliver at this particular service level in order to maintain my customer experience, then I can take proactive actions to ensure that I don't cross my SLO, right? And that is really the planning piece of it, right? So the thing what we have to do for software systems is start planning for these kinds of incidents. For example, as you know, in Netflix, they plan for a massive like Amazon cluster going down, or servers going down, or application systems going down, but they have very strict SLOs for saying my response time for, let's say, a user looking for a particular video, or response time for streaming cannot come below certain thresholds, right? And so they use that planning data to understand, okay, what do I need in customer infrastructure to plan so that my SLOs never get violated, right? So that's really the key piece of it. And of course, in order to be able to do that successfully, you have to do things like capacity planning, right? You got to make sure your architecture scales. You got to make sure that you have ability to scale up or scale down as and when the demand changes. Or, for example, the ability to do failover. For example, if something fails, like in Brazil, there's one power plant that caught fire. Not everybody, right? But they didn't plan for it, right? I mean, they could have planned for failovers. So those are all examples of planning that could have been done better.
And we have some friends just joining us here in this live. But I'm gonna ask Thiago. Thiago, what do you do? What are you curious about to ask from Shamim?
No, Shamim, what I think about that, I agree with you in everything, but I have one word: empathy. Okay, empathy.
Yes.
Because when we are teaching also about SRE, we are focusing on quality and also customer centricity.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
That's the main point. And when we have a problem with that kind of thing, because as we can see, and also in your blog, the companies was. We can say that all companies from Texas and also from Brazil was not prepared to the catastrophe.
Yes, exactly.
Right? And also there's one thing very in my opinion, very important on that. Our companies didn't offer neither an explanation or apologize for that. When we are talking about a customer centricity and we forgot or we are not put the client, the customer on the center of the situation, we will lose the clients, we will lose the customer. In that case, we are talking about lives, right? It's very kind different. Okay, it's a very a situation very very important and difficult to treat. We are talking about lives, and so what the importance of life on that case? That's the situation. What do you think when we are talking about systems that are treating lives? What do you think? Should be the treatment on that from the companies?
Absolutely.
You thought that has customer empathy, right?
Yeah.
Yep. And thanks for that question, Thiago, because that brings me to my second point, which is the focus around customer experience, right? So when we are building systems and we want to make them reliable, we focus on infrastructure and everything. But at the end of the day, it's all about customer experience. The whole reason why we're doing that is to ensure high customer experience around the interaction with digital systems. If we don't design our systems for ensuring customer experience, then I think it doesn't make any sense, because everything will start to break down from there, right? And you so rightly pointed out, Thiago, that there was very little empathy. And as you know, systems will sometimes fail, and customers understand that.
Yeah.
If you treat customers with empathy, you provide them the right information. For example, tell them, okay, we understand this has happened, we're apologizing, and we give you some dates for, okay, system will be back up by this time. Customers will work with you, right?
Yeah.
But in this case, for example, personal example, the power company that gives me power in my house, they had this notification system. So I signed up for that, right? And all the notifications were wrong, right? They said the power was going to come back by this time, and it never came back. And I was so frustrated, right? So in other words, not only were not taking accountability, but they're not also keeping us informed, right? So I think we heard about, for example, systems at Google fail, systems at Amazon fail, right? They're very prompt about notifying the customers that we understand the problem has happened, we're working on it. We can plan for the system to be back in half an hour or whatever, right? And they might also give refunds, right? On the other hand, in Texas, you know what happened, right? People got large bills, even though they didn't have power. So, I mean, this is like the entire opposite of customer experience and empathy. But I think, such a good point, Thiago, that if you don't design for customer experience, everything else is meaningless, right? So it's not only important to have good backend systems, but also very good to have good CRM, right? Customer relationship management, and show empathy, because most customers will understand, right? And they will work with you, and they might actually become more loyal because of the way you treat them and how you get out. And they will come back to you. And that's what's happening with Netflix, right? It's not that Netflix doesn't go down. It goes down, but it recovers gracefully, and they keep their customers, they give refunds, they give them more freebies, right? And customers keep coming back, right? That's a great.
And Shamim, I mean, in order to be prepared, I remember when I met Shamim 2 years ago in Silicon Valley. So after we met, I went, I also have some visits at LinkedIn and Netflix, and really talk about this, the chaos engineering and also testing. How, I mean, tell us a little bit how your experience, how you correlate that the chaos engineering and testing with these outages, and also with this service virtualization, as you used to correlate as well.
Yeah, thank you, Bazaar, for that. And that brings me to my third point, which is chaos engineering and chaos testing. So the scenarios that we're talking about, for example, in Texas or in Brazil, are essentially chaos events, right? Things that completely disrupt the system. And even though they don't happen frequently, we know that they might happen, right? And the way we prepare for that kind of events in a software system is what we call chaos engineering, right? Where we intentionally disrupt the system to see how the system reacts, right? For example, let's say for Netflix, they regularly do chaos engineering in production environments. Well, they'll just take a whole Amazon cluster down, right? Because that could happen. It's not likely to happen, but it could happen. And they want to see how the system reacts to that. Can I spin up another cluster? Can I fail over, right? So the way we have to do this is to make this a discipline, right? In other words, this is not something random that I pull a plug, right? So you have to build out all the chaos engineering scenarios. For example, the scenarios could be, for example, this cluster going down or the server going down, et cetera, et cetera. Then you're going to deploy, create a set of test suites that you can regularly run as part of that scenario, right? So you create what we call chaos monkeys, right? These are the bots that keep running periodically, et cetera, et cetera. And then you need to be able to observe. You have to monitoring solutions that will monitor how is the system behaving once you deploy these disruptive scenarios, right? And you have to also monitor how your system is recovering, how your SLOs and SLIs are performing. So all of those disciplines around purposefully injecting disruptive events, testing for those things, monitoring how the system is reacting, and how the recovery is a key part of what we call chaos engineering and testing. Now, one of the key things that you mentioned, I'm so glad you did, is service virtualization. So service virtualization is a technology that allows you to simulate an endpoint, right? So for example, if you have an application that depends on another application, right? What happens if this application A is depending on B and B goes down, right? Now, how do you sort of do that easily? I mean, of course, you could forcefully, turn B off, but an easier way to do that is to, let's say, have a simulator that represents B, and all of a sudden it becomes so much more easier, right, for you to turn that connection on or off. Same thing with Amazon, right? For example, it's not easy to say, take an Amazon cluster down, because you have to work with Amazon. They're not going to let you do that easily, right? Whereas if I had virtualized that infrastructure, I would just, simulate the complete shutdown at cluster or a server or hardware, and I can now run my tests so much more easily. I can simulate all these different kind of failure conditions much more easily using service virtualization than if I were to use some real physical hardware systems. And that's really the power of the service virtualization.
Shamim, you came a very interesting point. When you talk about, for instance, Agile and all those DevOps buzzwords, we think Agile is just about, assembly squads, right? But it's about to have Agile process and also to have Agile architecture. So how do you think this, you think microservice architectures could help with failure containment? When Texas had this different source, but what else could be done and the similarities with software? I don't know, Thiago, if you want to complement my question.
No, that's right, and I also understand the same thing from you, and also only in addition, like when we are talking about plan and chaos engineering, Amapá State has 3 hydroelectric plants, for example, and share frontiers with the state, Pará, Brazil's second largest producer of electricity. Strangely, Amapaenses pay the highest electricity bills in the country and appear to have no protection against the power thieves. So, when we are talking about chaos engineering, in that case, how could then simulate in case of we are talking, let's do the parallel related to the microservice. How could we do that? The frontiers should be tested, right? So that's the only addition.
And that brings me to my next point, which is using architectures to localize failures, right? So as you mentioned, right, typically whole systems don't fail at once, right? It starts with one pocket here and there. And if you can localize the failure to that particular component of the system and somehow recover from that and prevent the failures from spreading, then I think we will be more reliable. So the whole idea of microservices is to be able to deploy software in small components, right, that are well managed, well containerized, and well isolated, right, from each other, right? So because you have, partitioning of responsibilities. So if a particular microservice or a cluster of microservices fail, we have the architectural capability to quickly recognize what failed and quickly do a failover, right? And not let the other systems that are dependent on it fail also. And again, how do we test this? Again, service virtualization, Bizarre, as mentioned, could become a very important way, because you can now start to do test scenarios where all kinds of things failing at different points to see how well you can start to localize the failures, right? So I think that's a very, very important point, Thiago, is that unlike in old systems where we're monolithic, right? So if something fails, everything fails. But now we are talking about software systems that are built using plug and play and small units. So if something small fails, we have a greater degree of opportunity to localize the failure to that small thing, right? And redirect traffic around it to other components, to other things, maybe spin up new components, right? That is not possible using monolithic architectures. And if you look at the system that we have in Texas, it's kind of like a monolithic architecture, right?
Yes, right?
One thing fails and everything fails, yeah.
And,
whereas software systems should not be built like that anymore. So completely agree with you.
What about interoperability?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the next question.
And that was your video, highlighted that so well. Was that right? So you're talking about the Texas grid, and you're not connected to the rest of the United States, so it's isolated, right? So even though there are parts of the of the country that were much colder than Texas was, they never had outages, right? Because they were exchanging power with each other. Whereas Texas was isolated, right? So it chose to be isolated, which means that when we had a shortage, we couldn't get power from outside of Texas. I mean, that's a big problem, right? So we know in software systems that interoperability is absolutely key, not only from a perspective of how we do engineering, but also in terms of how we deploy systems, right? When we have APIs around microservices, we have to make sure that these are able to communicate with each other and interoperate with each other seamlessly. Yes,
and I also can think in how we are monitoring our system, right?
Yeah.
In terms of observability, because there is a difference between monitoring and observability, right?
Yes.
So that's a way to identify some problems in monolithic systems, right?
Yeah.
That's my thing also. Only in addition to what you are just talking, how could we identify? In that case, for example, the root cause. How could we identify the root cause when we are not using microservices systems, okay, or APIs? For example, in Amapá, an investigation showed that the substation had not been struck by lightning.
Huh. Okay.
But the transformers failed because they were not being properly maintained.
Okay. Lack of maintenance, right?
The basics of the basics, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But and it comes to costs, right? Because Alexander just brought this question here. So the challenge of increasing availability without increasing cost. We can cut maintenance. That's what happened, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, as the Texas example showed, that it's not like they didn't have money to do it, right? I mean, of course, you want to create, improve reliability because the most important factor is customer experience. At what cost do you want to achieve the right level of customer experience? So in this case, really, they didn't really have any goals for CX at all, right? Or any kind of customer empathy. So I think, Alexander, to your point, right? So we have to decide, well, how does the business value customer experience? If it is valuable, you have to make an investment in making sure that you are able to provide that level of reliability in your system. Now, obviously, you can choose to have different level of SLOs, right? So if you feel that, okay, for example, like Google has multiple types of customers, free customers, paying customers, right? So for free customers, you can choose to have a low level of SLO, right? So that way you can keep your costs limited for those kinds of systems, versus for paying premium customers, you really have to invest, right? Because you're getting money from your customers, right? So you have to do all those kind of adjustments. There's not one thing that says, okay, I have to provide same reliability for everybody, right? So depending on what kind of customers you have and what kind of relationship or what kind of SLOs you've established, invest in the right places to ensure the right level of reliability.
But in fact, Shamim, the costs, they just came up when the power, went down, right?
Yeah, and there is a lot of thing is related to quality.
And everybody paid.
Yeah.
Quality.
And then when you have a system, you actually pay a lot more, right? So at the end of the day, the disaster is going to cost you a lot more, right, than the initial investment, right? So again, it goes back to long-term strategic planning. I mean, you can't think about, I'm investing in reliability to make up money right there and then. It's a long-term horizon. I mean, you're investing to get customers and keep customers, right? Loyal customers, which all goes back to the customer experience point that you were making, Thiago was making, right? If I have good customer experience, I will have my customers for the longer term, and I will make eventually my money relative to the investment I made.
Right? And Shamim, we brought in your blog a very interesting point about the multi-stakeholder collaboration.
Yes.
I used to say that collaboration is not just goodwill. It's not just, I want to collaborate. It just involves method, involves discipline. In fact, in our teams, we don't know how to collaborate, although we want to, right?
Yeah.
So how I think DevOps and SRE, helps with collaborations in the app.
Yeah. So as you know, SRE is a DevOps discipline, right? And DevOps by definition is all about collaboration, right? It's not so much about technology and everything, but you have to have all the different stakeholders that are involved in the application lifecycle, right? The developers, the testers, the release managers, the operations guys. All of these guys must collaborate with each other, because if you don't, you create islands of information and islands of automation, right? And then you create these kind of situations. For example, you don't really know what's happening in one part of the system, or the developers don't know what's going on with the operations guys don't know how to sustain something the developers have built, right? So with good collaboration, you're able to bridge all those gaps and take out the blind spots, right? There are so many blind spots along an application lifecycle, right? And I think Thiago is right. If you have observability, you can actually address some of those blind spots, because what that does is you take all the monitoring data, and on top of that, you can begin to get insights. Hey, this is missing, that is missing, and that can help to address those blind spots. So I think we should need to have both collaboration to proactively address that, and observability to make sure that anything we missed, we are able to find out proactively, right, from the data the system is telling us, right, and address it proactively as well.
Okay, I'm going to pass to Thiago for the next question. But before that, as you know, Thiago, I like this when you talk about inclusive leadership. So I have this today with us, Tatiana from the Femtech. So it's a group of girls that, trying to stimulate girls to come to the tech. So Tatiana is with us, and so very glad to see her there. Thiago, it's you.
Oh yeah, there is a book here from Andre. You know that, Alex. You know that.
Yes,
yeah,
Alex Barnes is my colleague. Yeah.
You know, in fact, Alex just told me he was not going be able to be with us today, Shamim, because he's flying back from Brazil to US.
That's right. That's right.
Now he's in the plane, but
this is the plane.
He was supposed to watching us after. Maybe tomorrow.
Yeah.
Oh, great. But my last questions relate to the also collaboration, but there's a thing based on when we should what you think about shift left when we are talking about SRE, because there are some concepts here that SRE is only for a sysadmin team or operational team, but in some place SRE is only for that area. It's not related to the design. As I showed here in that book, we can see that. But what do you think about shift left?
This is a very interesting novel. It's not because Alex is our friend. He's really.
Yeah. It's freezing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Alex and I have known each other for a long time, and he wrote this wonderful book, right? But I completely agree with Thiago that SRE is not an operational function, right?
Yeah.
It may be. They are software engineering operations, but by virtue of the fact that they are software engineers, they really have to participate in the entire life cycle. And there was another blog I wrote around how the SRE functions shift to the left and how SRE integrates with the safe agile model, right? So SREs have to get involved right in the very beginning. I mean, planning is a shift left activity, right? I mean, you have to go think about how do you plan the architecture? How do you plan for new features? What is the capacity? What is the architecture? How do you review the requirements? How do you make sure that the architecture is ready for scaling and things like that? And then the SRE has to be involved along the whole DevOps lifecycle. So, for example, when you're creating new code, you have to be making sure that it can be deployed correctly, right? Why? Because what if something goes wrong? You have to be able to roll back. You don't test rollback in production. You have to test rollback in pre-production, right? How do you know that you can roll back a system if you don't already test it? So that's another example where SREs need to get involved in release planning and release orchestration. Make sure that all those things are. The other example is let's say somebody makes a configuration change that's going to go into production, right? Like a security patch or a change in infrastructure. The SRE has to be very, very careful and involved in that, making sure that that configuration can be deployed safely, because that is one of the main reasons why systems fail, right? So again, that's another example of a shift left. And also too, right, unlike Netflix, which can afford to run their chaos things in production, many companies cannot, right? Because, for example, financial services, I don't know if you can run chaos engineering in production, so they'll run it in pre-production. That's another example of how SRE can shift left and help, harden the system by injecting all these catastrophic conditions in pre-production and running and learning from them. Also, being able to run, capacity tests, load tests is also part of the shift left that SRE has to be involved in. So there's a whole bunch of activities, Thiago, that the SREs have to really do in shift left, and not just an operation function.
Yeah.
Thiago, I had a personal class from Shamim about shift left. Look this. Remember that?
My goodness.
That was in Silicon Valley.
Yes, of course.
Remember that? So Shamim was
I remember now. Yeah, that was a pre-COVID era that we used to go to our office. It was so nice. Yeah.
You see what? So it's that was a personal class I had. So Shamim, you are just running out of our 30 minutes time. But what would be your final recommendation to our friends when it comes to application reliability?
Yeah. So you know what? I like to conclude by talking about the cyber physical systems, right? So I mean, think about the Texas power grid or the Brazilian power grid. These are all what we call physical systems, right? But more and more of such systems are getting digitalized, right? So digital transformation is happening in every industry, in every domain, right? So my question is how in that kind of domain where you have physical systems and software systems working together, how can we start to improve reliability? And I've been thinking a great deal about this concept of digital twins. And Bazaar, you remember when we did our first coffee talk, we talked about digital twins. So a digital twin is really a simulation of a physical system in a software context. Like unlike service virtualization, which simulates a software endpoint, this is a simulation of a physical asset in the software world, right? So I can begin to simulate, for example, what a transformer does, or for example, for example, when they're building out these, rocket systems, the SpaceX programs, they're very, very sophisticated, digital twinning systems so that they can run tests in the virtual world and begin to understand how will a real system behave, right, before they actually construct the system physically, right? So I would think that we have to do more and more of this digital twinning of our physical assets and create a complete model of the entire system where everything is simulated. And now I can start to say, well, what if I now intentionally eject, like what if the cold weather came in and I froze all these pipes, right? What would happen? Can I deal with that? Could have prevented it? For example, now we're seeing in our homes, there are these little digital sensors that I can put in my plumbing system, that every time there's a leak, the system can detect the leak and immediately shut down the water supply, right? And the same thing can go into your main water supplies and everything, which means that if I actually had such a system, and if I could train the system to actually think about these kind of situations, I would probably not have suffered the damage I had in my home, right? Or the city would not suffer damage from all this dam burst pipes and things like that. So I'm thinking very much, Bazaar, that we need to think very, very seriously about digital twinning, how we can bring the digital transformation for these physical systems by bringing in this concept of digital twinning to help them improve the reliability.
I have to ask you is from my dear friend Priscila Rocha. This is in Portuguese, but she's just saying there is so much resistance. You still have so much resistance, and people just seeing availability. Just one more thing to do, as just Thiago said. How to stimulate that? How to make people understand that is important? I used to say quality is by design, not by accident, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll bring the accident. But how to stimulate that? What's the best? I mean, way to do that you have seen globally in your experience?
Well, at the end of the day, as you mentioned, you have to have good customer experience for your systems, right? I mean, everything has to be rooted around that. So if you believe that you're going to have generate customer experience, good customer experience for your systems, it comes back to, are you being able to address what your customers need? And quality is one of those needs, right? And it won't happen by accident, it happens by design, right? So we got to think about, okay, what kinds of changes do we need to make in our process to ensure high customer experience? And the answer may be that it's not just about testing, right? I mean, testing is just one way to ensure quality. There are other newer ways that we're talking about, right? For example, through chaos engineering and chaos testing and things like that, that also help you understand how your systems are going to react when disruption happens and how you can better prepare for that, right? And why is this important? As I said, I mean, if this thing happened for a real business and it was handled like the way Texas did it, they would probably be out of business today, right? You don't want that. Whereas, so I think that's the key thing, is that we really, really have to plan for how do I create a sustainable, customer experience for my customers so that I can be a profitable business myself, right? And customers love me and they would like to, stay on and give me more and more business, right? And that's why we need these initiatives and drive it from top down as part of a customer experience initiative.
Very good. So I'd like to thank you very much, Thiago. I'd like to thank you very much for being with us. Just enriched the talk, and always a pleasure to talk to you and to see you in several different stages.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much. And the main point that I can give you guys that are watching us, I really believe that the most important behavior should be the empathy, because they are the clients, the customer, they are the most important asset, right? And they are the reason for the company existence. So when we are producing something to us in place of empathy, in place of we really will produce and will deliver something with right quality. Okay, that's the point. It was a pleasure, Bezerra. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Bezerra. Thank you, Thiago.
It was a pleasure to have this coffee talk. I hope you have some. Next time, I'm going to invite Alex to be with us here as well, so he can talk to us and talk about season 2, right?
Yes. Yes. Okay.
Thank you very much. I really like it a lot, and thank you all my friends to be here today. And I'm gonna pass the video again for people who didn't have the opportunity to watch it in the beginning, and I'm gonna just start here and start again. Maybe 2-3 weeks. Gonna back with another Encontros por acaso. Thank you very much, Shamim. Very good to meet you, and thank you, Thiago.
See you. Bye bye.
Obrigado, gente.
Obrigado.
Até a próxima. Tchau, tchau. Obrigado.
Ciao.
In mid-February, cold Arctic air, usually contained up north in the Earth's jet stream, dipped down into the U.S. It's called a polar vortex, and it's pretty common. It's what brings the coldest air to the U.S. during the winter. What was unusual is for it to dip as far south as it did. In Texas, where February is typically fairly warm, temperatures dipped dangerously low. And it came with a storm. More than 4 million Texans lost power. Many wouldn't get it back for nearly 5 days. By then, pipes had frozen, people were melting snow for drinking water, and dozens had died from the cold in their cars and in their homes. And it was almost even worse. The state's entire electrical grid was within seconds and minutes of a failure that would have lasted months. But even though this storm hit this huge area, it was really just Texas that had major loss of power. There's a reason for that, and it should be a warning sign for the rest of the US. When you flip your lights on, you're getting your electricity from the power grid. And that grid is getting the electricity from a bunch of different energy systems, like nuclear power plants or wind farms or natural gas facilities. In the US, these places are generally run by private energy companies that work with your local power utility, which directs the electricity around the grid and into your home. That power utility is overseen by a government commission who sets things like prices and safety standards. And the grids most Americans are on aren't just big, they're huge. The entire East Coast, from Canada to Florida, is on one grid, and the entire West Coast is connected in another.
It's kind of a remarkable engineering feat. It's probably the biggest machine humans have ever built.
While most power tends to stay local, this grid allows electricity to flow over huge areas and between states. Like in New York City, power comes from energy plants in New York, but also from neighboring states and even Canada. This huge grid also means in emergencies, power can be directed where it's needed. Like in Oklahoma, which was also hit bad during the February winter storm. They needed more power, and instead of completely losing it, they were able to get electricity from neighboring states through the grid. But it's not so seamless to send it to Texas. Texas opted out of the big grids, back when they were being built nearly 100 years ago. Since they covered several states, it meant the federal government could regulate them. Texas was not into that.
Texas decided to kind of go it alone. It's a very uniquely Texas-type thing to do, right?
So most of Texas is on its own grid. It means they don't have to follow the same regulations as the rest of the country, like reliability and cost standards. But it also means when it lost power in the storm, it couldn't easily get electricity from other states. Its independence kept it in the dark. But it wasn't the reason it went dark in the first place. Being on its own, Texas has to make all their own power. They have a variety of sources. When the storm came, it affected every one. Several coal plants stopped operating as coal piles froze. One of 4 Texan nuclear plants went offline. Some wind turbines stopped working in the freezing cold.
But the biggest failure in terms of its magnitude and its impact was the natural gas system.
Natural gas, which actually contains water vapor, froze in storage wells and pipelines. Every one of these systems failed, in part, and it had nothing to do with the type of energy and everything to do with these companies not being prepared for the cold.
Clearly, you can run an energy system in cold temperatures. There are wind turbines operating in Antarctica and gas plants in Alaska and Alberta. So this is not a technology-specific issue. It was more a failure to anticipate that this is something that could even occur in Texas at this, length and severity, and to prepare for extreme cold temperatures.
But it should have been anticipated, because this has happened in Texas before. In 1989, the same kind of Arctic storm caused natural gas plants to have the same problems, resulting in rolling blackouts. And the same thing again in 2011. And both times, federal commissions recommended utilities ensure reliability in extreme weather conditions, and specifically for the state government to create winterization standards for these energy sources. The Texas Utility Commission did make those standards, but also made them voluntary, so most companies didn't winterize. Private companies like these don't have an incentive to spend their money preparing for unpredictable and infrequent events without being required to. But this problem is not limited to Texas.
The particular vulnerability to the extreme cold may be a uniquely or extremely Texas thing. I think what it shows you is you need to check your blind spots, right? And that applies everywhere.
This is a chart of the last 40 years of severe weather disasters in the U.S. Storms in particular are in orange. Here is the Texas winter storm in 1989 and the one in 2011. These costly disasters are becoming more frequent, not just in Texas, but nationally and globally. And the U.S. is not prepared. Most of this grid was built 60 to 70 years ago, but was only built to last 50 years. And some studies point to nearly 100 facilities, like power plants, in immediate danger of flooding and storm surges. Most of these private energy companies across the U.S. aren't going to change unless they're required to. But these utility commissions can require it, as can state governments and the federal government. All three can even help pay for it. Texas was warned for 30 years to prepare its energy systems for severe weather and climate change, but they didn't. Now, the rest of the U.S. is facing the same problem.
It is a wake-up call for everywhere to think about how do we prepare our energy infrastructures and our other critical infrastructure for extreme events that may become more severe and may become more likely. And that isn't about just thinking about what's probable, but also what can break the system in a way that's catastrophic.